How do you define life? Is it based on longevity, or is it about what you do with the time you're given? John Reed died a young man, and yet, in the 32 years he existed on Earth, it was like he lived several lifetimes. Born into privilege, Reed was an incredibly fascinating character. His story lends itself to someone becoming a beneficiary of capitalism, yet that wasn't the path he decided to take. Instead, Reed was a socialist, then a communist, a journalist, a poet, a war correspondent, and a revolutionary. Reed existed in a world in turmoil, the early 20th century, where things were changing faster than anyone could have imagined. He saw the pain and suffering this new world was creating, and he made sure to write about it, speak out against it, walk the walk, and talk the talk, even when it meant he made powerful enemies in the process. This is how John Reed went from a rich kid in Portland to an enemy of the United States and a darling of the Soviet Union. Welcome back to Biographics. I'm your host, cosmic horror author Eric Malachite, and today's script was written by James CJ. So be sure to show him some love in the comments as you deploy your likes, subscribe and ring that bell, and share this video with someone who loves learning about historical figures. Let's get to it. John Silas Reed was born on October 22, 1887 in Portland, Oregon, into an affluent family with an impressive net worth. The product of the generational wealth on his mother, Margaret's side, as her father, Henry Dodge Green, amassed his fortune as a Portland industrialist. Reed's father, Charles Jerome, was from a less affluent but still respected family, the son of an agricultural machinery manufacturer representative. Say that 5 times fast. Without question, John Reed was born into a position of privilege, something not lost on him as he grew older. He was part of the Portland elite, and he and his brother Harry attended the private school Portland Academy. Reed initially was a good student, but as he got older, he found himself only engaging when something interesting was introduced. A lover of creating and telling stories, Reed complained that school was stuck in the past, using dead techniques and strict structures that didn't cater to one's creative energy, which he had in spades. Others viewed John as a smart child with a difficult nature. He had a difficult time growing up for several reasons, including his social issues, small size, and most importantly, his numerous health issues, for which the root cause is unknown. Reed primarily suffered from what is now believed to be kidney problems. So, when he was constantly surrounded by servants, he was also surrounded by nurses, with his health only improving when he turned 16. By the end of his high school education, Reed had already experienced a lot more than the average person. The rest of his life would prove to be nothing short of a roller coaster of contradictions and dangerous adventures in pursuit of the truth and justice. Which invention do you think we couldn't survive without? Fire, medicine, maps? But imagine this, what would you do if you had to start civilization from scratch tomorrow? Well, wonder no more, because with today's sponsor Hungry Minds and their book The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding a Civilization, you can get an overview of pretty much everything needed to restart civilization. This hefty thing was a smashing success on Kickstarter and Indiegogo, amassing over $3.2 million from investors, and now it's a bestseller. This isn't just a book, but rather a 400-page illustrated encyclopedia offering a fascinating journey through 180 topics that cover the most significant discoveries and inventions in human history. The book appeals to both adults and children and features beautiful handcrafted artwork in the form of engineering drawings and medieval art. It also makes a great gift. So what are you waiting for? Follow the link in the description or scan the QR code which you can see right now on the screen, and make a purchase using promo code Biographics10. And now back to the video. One of the most interesting relationships Reed ever had was with his father. It was a relationship of expectation and opportunity. Charles wanted the best for his son, and he made sure to use every lever in his power to ensure that was the case. He wanted John to go to Harvard, and so in 1904 he sent a 17-year-old Reed to Morristown School in New Jersey for a year and a half to shape him into a worthy candidate. Things for Reed improved dramatically as he grew up during his Morristown years. He was no longer the small, weak, sickly boy who was outside of the social circle. He was a tall, handsome, charismatic boy who'd grown into himself, what we sometimes refer to as a glow-up. He became far more engaged with school activities, participating in football, cheerleading, and drama. He also continued showing an interest in the world of journalism with his work on the editorial boards of the Harvard Monthly and Lampoon, both early journalistic highlights for the young writer. Of course, it wasn't all good. Reed still had a habit of finding himself in trouble. He enjoyed the limelight, but it came with consequences, and he'd often have notes of disciplinary action listed in his school reports. His time at Harvard opened Reed up to new ideas and ways of thinking, while also solidifying his passion for writing. Now, though, it was time to leave school behind and see what the world had to offer a young, idealistic man. It turns out, in John's case, it had a whole lot to offer. After graduating from Harvard in 1910, Reed traveled, leaving the US in July and traveling to England, France, and Spain before returning to America several months later in March 1911. The origins of the trip were based on what Reed's favorite professor had told him about needing to experience and see life if he wanted to write about it successfully. You know, that whole thing where you write about what you know. Following the trip, Reed returned home, briefly engaged to a French woman who'd remained in France. But this relationship didn't go anywhere, and it became nothing more than a footnote in Reed's life. Upon returning to Portland, he found his family in a financial situation far different than when he'd left. While the family had the appearance of money, they were drowning in mortgage payments and diluted ownership of the Green Reed real estate holdings to the point where John's parents were barely getting by. To forge his own path, John chose to leave Portland for New York in hopes of entering the world of journalism. The next 3 years of Reed's life would be spent immersing himself in writing, learning to be a journalist, exploring New York City, building relationships, and learning more about people. John Reed was looking to be a part of life, to understand it, to seize it. Over the years, he had 3 central relationships in the city: investigative journalist Lincoln Steffens, who helped establish Reed's early New York journey, writer and activist Max Eastman, who would be Reed's future boss, and Mabel Dodge, patron of the arts, who would be one of Reed's early romantic interests. Steffens was considerably older than Reed and acted as more of a mentor to him. He was considered one of the leading reform-minded journalists and writers known as muckrakers back in the early progressive era. It was through Steffens, whom Reed met at Harvard, that he acquired his first job in journalism, a low-level editorial job at the American magazine. Reed's father asked Steffens for assistance, stating in a letter to Steffens, "Get him a job, let him see everything, but don't let him be anything for a while. Don't let him get a conviction right away, or a business or a career. Let him play." New York City brought out more than just a carefree soul who wanted to be a journalist and embrace all that life in the city had to offer. It brought out the poet in him. During his years at the American magazine, he wrote about the city in a personal capacity, writing about the contrast between the rich and poor, the unstoppable nature of the city, the bohemian intellectual scene specifically in his area of Greenwich Village, and the lives of the working class. The vast majority of these poems, the exact number of which is unknown, went unpublished. On a professional writing level, Reed did a lot of freelance work from 1911 to 1913. He began seeking to establish himself as a freelance writer. Eventually, he landed a more permanent job at the socialist publication The Masses, edited by Max Eastman in 1913, where he would start making his mark. It was during these years at the Masses that John Reed's ideology and politics truly started to develop. His journalistic career was taking off as he began covering protests and labor strikes. He was sympathetic to the Socialist Party, which he'd formally joined in 1916, and even spent a lot of time surrounded by like-minded reform journalists and muckrakers. From 1913 onwards, it was the period of John Reed's radicalization. That year, Reed covered the Patterson Silk Strike, an event that changed him dramatically. He not only witnessed the violence firsthand, but he also experienced it. The brutality of law enforcement on the strikers who beat, silenced, and arrested many of them left a profound impact. But it was his own arrest that sealed his radicalization. He wrote about how the Patterson Company was behaving against their workers, which was contrary to American ideals. He was incensed by the ordeal in New Jersey, feeling that for over a decade not enough had been done to help them. It was clear in his writing that Reed wasn't just an observer anymore. He was an advocate, a voice for the voiceless. At the same time all this was happening, Reed was developing a relationship with Mabel Dodge, a woman 8 years his senior. Dodge was a complex woman, wealthy, bored, and free-spirited. The two met running in the same circles in Greenwich and shared similar values. At the time of their meeting, Dodge was married and had a son. Reed and Dodge worked together on the silk mill strike, rallying the workers, which is largely where their romantic relationship developed. It was never destined to succeed, seeing as Reed was young and energetic about life and the world, while Dodge was looking for something slower and quieter. The two would break up before Reed started his biggest job yet for the Metropolitan, covering the Mexican Revolution. However, they'd reconnect several times before it was truly over. In the autumn of 1913, Reed headed to Mexico, where he began a series of articles on Mexican revolutionary Pancho Villa. His work spoke out against American intervention and was his first time covering an armed conflict. Just before the trip commenced, Reed and Dodge had reconciled, but things soured yet again when she joined him on his journey to Mexico. She stayed for only a few days, but she was with someone who was fully invested in what he was writing, not her. She returned to New York, where she started an affair with another young man. The two would reconnect once more before their relationship fizzled out entirely following the release of Insurgent Mexico, a compiled book of his work covering the revolution. Following his work in Mexico, Reed went to Colorado on April 14, 1914, where a labor strike situation was deteriorating into an all-out local war. Since September 1913, it had been the scene of the coalfield war between the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company and the United Mine Workers Union. Reed was there for about a week, and he'd come just after what became known as the Ludlow Massacre, which happened on April 20th. The incident saw the Colorado National Guard and Colorado Fuel and Iron Company private security attack 1,200 striking coal miners who'd set up a tent colony after being kicked out of their company housing. The attack resulted in the deaths of 25 people, including women and children. Reed was beginning to focus on his beliefs that capitalism was failing ordinary people in favor of the rich like Rockefeller, who owned the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company and who Reed blamed for the death and chaos he'd covered. Reed had seen the injustice and violence in New Jersey, violence in Mexico, and murder at the hands of the rich in Colorado. But he was about to face the biggest conflict the world had ever seen. The year was 1914, and the bloodiest war the world had ever seen was about to begin, and Reed was about to be changed because of it. Not long after the war in Europe broke out, Reed set off for England to start covering the war on the Western Front. He left on August 14, 1914, on assignment for the Metropolitan, but was still an occasional contributor for the masses. Covering the war proved to be challenging in numerous ways for Reed. There was a heavy amount of censorship taking place, and making it to the front lines was next to impossible. During his first European trip, he'd have his third and final encounter with Dodge, which was brief. By December 1914, he was back in New York, where he continued writing about the war thousands of miles away from any combat. John would return to Europe in 1915, covering the Eastern Front, where he had far more success. He chronicled his experiences in his 1916 book, The War in Eastern Europe. Following his time as a war correspondent in World War I, he returned home to Portland for a while to visit his family following his father's death. During his visit, Reed met Louisa Bryant, and the two began a relationship that progressed quickly. The two married in November 1916. John and Louisa's marriage was different from other marriages of the time, with it being more open. However, it's not necessarily true that both parties agreed to this. Reed was never fully comfortable with the arrangement and often found himself hurt by Louisa's more emotionally detached openness in their relationship. Of course, he also engaged in the occasional affair himself. The next few years weren't easy for Reed. He was facing challenges in his work, his health, and his marriage. For starters, his time with the Metropolitan had ended. He wasn't getting as much work. Health-wise, he was deteriorating and had to have an operation in November 1916 to remove a kidney, although due to conflicting reports, it's not entirely clear if that's the procedure Reed underwent. Additionally, he was losing faith in his country following Wilson's decision to join the war, which he believed would never happen. What he'd soon find out as he continued writing about the war for the masses was that his paper and many others would become targets of the Wilson administration and the newly passed Espionage Act of 1917. The U.S. Post Office refused to mail the newspaper, among others critical of the war, and the magazine lost its funding as a result of Reed's anti-war pieces, leading to its ceasing publication altogether to Reed's shock. Reed, silenced by censorship, was growing increasingly sour with America, and this would lead him to places nobody could have seen coming, not even Reed himself. It was August 1917. Reed and Bryant left New York City for Europe on their way to report on the unfolding political crisis in Russia. They arrived shortly after a failed military coup against the Alexander Kerensky Provisional Government, which had replaced the monarchy following the February Revolution. The situation in Russia was dire, with political instability at the heart of the problems, combined with an economy in shambles, food shortages, and civil unrest running rampant. It was in the chaos that the Bolsheviks rose in prominence, offering a brighter vision for the future of Russia led by Vladimir Lenin, who promised peace, land, and power to the people. On October 7, 1917, the Winter Palace, the seat of the Kerensky government, was captured, and Reed and Bryant witnessed it all. By January 1918, Reed had met some of the major Bolsheviks, such as Leon Trotsky, Vladimir Lenin, and many other high-ranking officials. He was welcomed as a sympathetic observer of the newly formed government and even helped out the Bolsheviks where possible. To fund and extend his stay, Reed went on to work for the International Red Cross, where he was part of a newspaper set up to promote American interests. Reed was enthusiastic about the revolution and was even willing to fight for the cause if necessary, to join the Red Guards. Lenin was largely supportive of Reed, even offering him a post at one point as the Soviet consul in New York. But this was withdrawn after other parties worked to kill the nomination. Reed left Petrograd in early February 1918, a month after Louisa. After a lengthy journey home, he found himself in trouble with the law again, this time as a result of his work with the masses, causing law enforcement to scrutinize Reed's journalism, resulting in his papers being confiscated at the point of entry in New York. This was a problem, as these were the notes that he planned to use to write his book on his time in Russia. He'd only get them back in November that year. Between Reed and Bryant, the two wrote their own books detailing their experience in Russia. Bryant published her book first in 1918, having the advantage of not having lost her notes. Reed's book, 10 Days That Shook the World, came out in 1919. The response to Reed's book was mixed. While positive on style and substance, it was critical of its sympathy for communism. In Russia, the response was mainly positive, with Lenin writing an introduction. Some took umbrage with the text later on, like Stalin, who stated that some of Reed's representations of certain figures were misleading. Stalin even went on to ban the book in later years following Lenin's death. Reed's time in Russia would define his legacy and cost him more than he could have ever known. The Espionage Act of 1917 was enacted just 2 months after the U.S. entered World War I. Reed found himself a victim of this law on numerous occasions. The point of the law was to suppress dissent. It was coupled with the Sedition Act of 1918. The Espionage Act prohibited the recording of pictures, obtaining information, or copying descriptions of information that endangers national security. The Sedition Act basically targets First Amendment rights by banning disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the United States government, its flag, or its armed forces against the U.S. government. When Reed and Bryant returned home in the early months of 1919, they faced questioning before the U.S. Senate, which was exploring Bolshevik propaganda. He was officially charged for his anti-war writings in the masses and the Liberator, along with a speech he'd given in Philadelphia. This resulted in his passport being seized, and he realized the government was watching him. He did win his case on the grounds of free speech, but it was just the start of the attacks against him. At the same time, Reed was involved in forming the Communist Labor Party of America. Reed helped create the party, drafted its platform and manifesto, and edited its paper. He used the Bolsheviks as shining examples of communism done right. Reed was not fearless. He did fear that he was likely to face arrest for his political activity and activism. So, in the fall of 1919, he forged the necessary documents, used contacts he'd made throughout his travels, and illegally left the United States for Russia, risking everything. He didn't know it then, but he'd never see his home again. By October, he crossed into Soviet territory, back with the revolutionaries he so admired. A line from Reed's book on the Russian Revolution perhaps best sums up what he'd just done and what was to come. I have seen the future and it works, but I did not know what it would cost me. Reed's arrival in Russia showed him the fallacies of what he'd believed was the answer to the world's problems. The Bolshevik system of governance wasn't producing the results he imagined. The nation was plagued with internal conflicts, food shortages, and general chaos. Reed was no longer an observer of revolution. He was a participant, and he saw it for everything it was, which wasn't always pretty. He made an attempt to return to the US in February of 1920 and was discovered in the coal bunker of a ship by Finnish customs on March 13th. He was interrogated, and once his identity was confirmed, he was beaten and held in an effort for him to give up his contacts, which he never did. Despite the threat of torture, he remained silent, and as a result wasn't charged with treason, but instead he was convicted of smuggling and having jewels in his possession. Despite paying the fine, he wasn't released, which was without question illegal. But the US authorities didn't care what happened to Reed, and the Finnish authorities didn't want to release him. His mental state and health overall, a constant struggle for Reed, took a hit during this period, primarily suffering from insomnia and depression. Back home, his wife and friends heard of his arrest and dire conditions he was facing and fought to have him released from the federal government. But they dragged their feet, uninterested in helping Reed. Eventually, Russia heard of his imprisonment and got involved. However, it was just months later before he was released by the Finnish government. He went back to Petrograd, where he spent a month recovering, having returned malnourished, suffering from scurvy, and in overall bad shape from the whole experience. Come August 10th, Louisa made her way to Moscow. At the time of her arrival, Reed was on a trip to Baku in the countryside, a place devastated by typhus and civil war. It was this trip, which Reed didn't want to go on but was pressured into by the Soviets, that pushed him to grow disillusioned with the communist movement. He eventually made his way back to Moscow and reunited with Louisa on September 15th. They spent the next 10 days together exploring Moscow, meeting with the leading Bolsheviks, and taking in the art and culture scene of the city. But Reed was ready to go home and face the music. On September 25th, 1920, John Reed began feeling ill, and 5 days later found himself in hospital. Despite his initial belief that it was influenza, the truth was much worse. Reed was diagnosed with spotted typhus. In some cases, this wasn't a terrible situation, but one that could be overcome, but there was an obstacle preventing him from getting the treatment he needed: the Allied blockade. John Reed would not get the life-saving medicine he needed. He would die in Russia, thousands of miles from home, in a country he no longer believed in. On October 17th, 1920, just 3 days shy of his 33rd birthday, John Reed died in Moscow with his wife holding his hand. The USSR honored Reed with a hero's funeral, before burying him at the Kremlin Wall Necropolis, the former USSR National Cemetery in Red Square, Moscow. Reed is among 3 other Americans who have received such treatment. His legacy is one that's heavily debated. It's undeniable that he had an impact on future journalists and poets, especially those rooted in activism. Many tend to focus on his radicalization because it's an easy road to stay on. However, for a moment, consider the 1910s through the eyes of John Reed. Unrest in a rapidly changing New York City, on the ground in Mexico during a revolution, the outbreak of World War I, and finally the events of the October Revolution and the drastic changes taking place in Russia following 1918. Reed saw a great deal in his short life. His radicalization is almost textbook. But in the end, Reed wanted everyone to have the same thing: justice. I hope you learned something today, and if you enjoyed today's video, be sure to deploy your likes, comment a historical figure we haven't covered yet, subscribe and ring that bell, and share this video with someone who loves learning about historical figures. I'm Eric Malachite, and we'll see you next time.